Next, let's take a look at another edge case, a real-world scenario or idea that strays from the focus of this course. You won't need to master this topic, but it's good to be aware that it exists and that you may encounter it outside of this course. So far, we've seen a very simple interface to Spring. Annotations on classes, and methods that have sensible defaults, and a simplified system of bean auto-configuration. This is the modern way to build Spring applications, and it speeds up development of initial prototypes greatly. This is a new way to configure Spring, though. Before it, there was only XML. There are good reasons to learn about Spring's XML configuration system. You may work on legacy projects that still use older versions of Spring or rely on XML configuration files written before Spring introduced annotations. Many resources online still use XML to describe integration with Spring, and since Spring still supports XML, you can use it in a pinch if you can't figure out how to achieve something with annotations. There's a lot you can do with Spring's XML configuration, but for now, we're just going to look at bean configuration, the same stuff we've been discussing this lesson. Try to visualize the mappings between the XML and annotation-based configurations we're about to look at. For example, let's look at creating a simple value as a bean. In Java, we would add an @beanAnnotated method to our @configurationAnnotated class. With XML, we add a bean element to our beans.xml or applicationcontext.xml file. Let's look a little closer at this configuration. At the top, you'll see the standard XML declaration, followed by a root element, beans. It has a lot of attributes that are responsible for defining which XML attributes, elements, and namespaces are applicable in this file, but we can mostly ignore those for now. They're part of the boilerplate Spring Boot is designed to eliminate. What's really important about this beans element is what's inside. Every child element represents a bean or bean configuration option for Spring. So, for example, to create a static string bean, we can write this. We configure a new bean by adding a bean element as a child of the beans element and giving it an ID. We don't have to do this when we use annotation-based configuration because Spring will automatically generate an ID based on either the annotated method or class name. In this XML configuration, though, it's important to be explicit because bean IDs are how we declare dependencies. Look how we set the value of the string bean with XML. We add a child constructor arg element to the bean, which has a value attribute, with the value of the string we want to instantiate. There are several different ways to inject data into a bean, but one of the simplest is through its constructor. Spring is able to use the class attribute of a bean element to call a constructor that matches its constructor arg elements. This ends up being entirely the same as how our @componentAnnotated classes work. Spring sees the class as a bean candidate and instantiates it by calling its constructor with the dependencies we've configured. Of course, with Spring Boot's auto-configuration enabled, we don't have to explicitly wire those dependencies. Spring looks at the available beans and connects them based on type. As you might suspect, it's a little more manual with XML. If we want to declare a different bean that depends on our string bean, we'd have to write something like this. In this hypothetical, we have a greeting service class, presumably responsible for greetings of some kind. We want to inject our string bean into the greeting service constructor, so we added a constructor arg element. But instead of specifying a value attribute, we add a ref attribute with the string bean's ID as its value. This tells Spring that we're referencing another bean and not supplying a raw value. We want our greeting to contain our message, not the string bean. So, those are just the basics of Spring XML configuration, the ones that are the most similar to how we configure Spring with annotations. There are a lot of other things you can configure with XML, including the options provided by annotations like @configuration, @componentscan, and more. A good rule to remember is that every Spring feature that can be configured by annotation can also be configured by XML. If you ever find yourself looking at an example of one but need the other, Head to Spring's official documentation for detailed instructions on how to translate between the two.